Somewhere in the mud of northern Kenya, there is a woman who never got to give birth. She was found in her final days of pregnancy, lying where she fell, her wrists bound behind her. She has been there for 10,000 years, and she was not alone. There is a number you have probably never thought about. 10,000 years. That is roughly how long people have been killing each other in organized groups, on purpose, as a group. Not one person attacking another in a moment of rage. Groups, planning, choosing targets, walking toward other human beings with the clear intention of ending their lives. We tend to imagine that this kind of violence is something civilization invented. Armies, borders, flags, something that needed cities and kings and written laws before it could exist. But in a dry, sunburned stretch of land in northern Kenya, scientists found something that breaks that comfortable idea completely. 27 bodies, left exactly where they fell, never buried, never mourned as far as anyone could tell. Among them, women, children, and a pregnant woman whose hands appear to have been bound before she died. No cities here, no kings, no farms, no metal weapons, no armies marching in formation, just hunter-gatherers, people who lived the way humans had lived for almost the entire span of our existence. And yet something walked into their camp and made sure none of them walked out. Welcome to the strange past, where the oldest stories are sometimes the hardest to look at. Go back, not to castles or kingdoms, not to the wars you learned about in school with names and dates and famous generals. Go further back than any of that. 10,000 years to a world with no permanent homes, no stored grain, no fences marking whose land was whose. Picture the land first, because it is nothing like the desert it is today. This is the edge of Lake Turkana, in what is now northern Kenya, but back then the lake stretched wider, and a shallow lagoon sat at its margin, full of fish, shellfish and water birds. You wake up here, and the lagoon is already loud with life. Birds calling, fish moving just under the surface, the smell of mud and water and green plants somewhere nearby. This is not a harsh landscape. This is one of the richest places you could possibly live in. Grasslands stretch beyond the water, full of game. The lagoon gives you fish without much effort, shellfish you can gather by hand, and birds that nest along the reeds. You do not farm. You do not need to. The land gives you almost everything, almost all the time. This should be the kind of place where nothing goes wrong. But there is a problem. Good land never stays a secret. And the climate around Lake Turkana in this period was beginning to shift, drying out in places, forcing groups to crowd closer to the most reliable water sources left. Imagine living somewhere that everyone wants. Other bands of people, other families, other groups who hunt the same animals, fish the same waters, gather the same shellfish from the same muddy banks. Most days you probably never even see them. The land is enormous, and groups like yours are small, scattered, spread out across huge distances. But the lagoon is not enormous. It is one specific, valuable, limited place. And limited places have a way of becoming dangerous. Now picture the day everything changed. You do not know it is coming. There is no scout running ahead to warn you, no smoke signal, no drumbeat in the distance. One moment, you are doing what you do every day. Fishing, gathering, watching children near the water's edge, and then suddenly you are not. Somewhere in that chaos was her, the woman whose body you already know about. She was close to giving birth, days away, maybe less. She did not run, or she could not. Someone tied her wrists, and someone made sure she never got back up. Now here is what the evidence actually shows, and it is worse than most reconstructions dare to say out loud. In 2012, a team from Cambridge University, led by Marta Mirazon-La, uncovered the remains of 27 people at a site now called Nataruk, 30 kilometers west of Lake Turkana. At least 8 were women. At least 6 were children, most of them under 6 years old. 12 of the skeletons were complete enough to examine closely, and 10 of those 12 showed unmistakable signs of violent death. Crushed skulls, broken hands, shattered knees and ribs, wounds in the neck consistent with arrows, and in 2 of the men, stone projectile points were still lodged inside the skull and chest, embedded in the bone itself. exactly where they struck. 4 of the skeletons, including the pregnant woman, show hand positions consistent with being bound before death. Not killed in self-defense, not killed while fighting back, restrained and then killed anyway. None of the bodies were buried. They were left exactly where they fell, in the mud at the edge of the lagoon. And the lagoon itself, drying up over the following centuries, sealed them in place like a photograph nobody meant to take. For the researchers who found them, the conclusion was almost unavoidable. This was not an accident, and it was not one person snapping in a fit of rage. This had the shape of something coordinated, a raid, an ambush, a group of people deciding together to walk toward another group of people and not let them leave alive. If that conclusion is correct, this is currently one of the oldest known pieces of physical evidence for group violence, for something close to what we would recognize today as war, anywhere in the human archaeological record. 10,000 years old, centuries before farming, long before the first city, long before anyone had a reason to fight over land, they had built themselves, crops they had planted, walls they had constructed. This was violence between people who, in theory, had nowhere they legally owned and nothing permanent to defend. And that single fact rewrites something most people assume without ever questioning it. We tend to imagine prehistoric humans as too busy surviving to organize something as complicated as an attack, too spread out, too small in number, too occupied with the next meal to plan the deaths of an entire camp full of people. Nataruk suggests otherwise. It suggests that the capacity for this kind of coordinated, lethal violence is not a side effect of civilization. It might be something far older, something woven into us long before we ever built a single permanent wall. Everything you just heard sounds like proof. Crushed skulls, bound wrists, children among the dead. Case closed, right? Not quite. But here is where the story takes a turn that most documentaries about Nataruk never mention. Not everyone agrees with this interpretation. And the disagreement is not a minor footnote. It goes to the very heart of what we think we are looking at. A separate team of researchers, led by Christopher Stoyanovsky at Arizona State University, went back through the original data and raised a serious challenge. Their argument, the skeletons found lying face down, were radiocarbon dated to a different period than the skeletons found lying on their sides. If true, that means not everyone at Nataruk died at the same moment, in the same event, on the same terrible day. Instead, the site might be something else entirely. Not a massacre frozen in time, a burial ground used repeatedly, over a much longer stretch of time, where different mortuary customs left bodies in different positions across the centuries. Some hunter-gatherer societies are known to have left certain bodies unburied as part of normal funerary practice, not as evidence of violence at all.
If you're enjoying this journey, leave a like.
If the critics are right, the most famous image from Nataruk, of a single bloody afternoon when an entire camp was wiped out in one coordinated strike, might not be quite accurate. It might instead be a quieter, stranger truth. Violent deaths, yes, scattered across many individuals, but possibly accumulated slowly, burial after burial, generation after generation, rather than erased in one single brutal hour. So which is it? A single massacre frozen at the edge of a lagoon, or a long-used burial site where the dead, killed at different times for different reasons, simply ended up resting in the same patch of ground? Right now, there is no way to know with absolute certainty. The original research team stands behind their massacre interpretation. The critics stand behind their dating challenge. And the bones themselves, the only witnesses that ever existed, cannot speak clearly enough to settle the argument. What we can say, what nobody seriously disputes, is this. At some point, or at several points, around 10,000 years ago near this lagoon, people were killed with intentional, sustained, deliberate violence. Crushed skulls do not happen by accident. Stone points embedded in bone do not happen by accident. Bound wrists do not happen by accident. Someone did this to other human beings, and whether it happened in one terrible afternoon or across a longer, darker pattern of repeated violence, the result is the same. Long before farming, long before cities, Long before anything we would call civilization, humans were already capable of this. Think about what that actually means for the people involved, whichever version turns out to be true. If it was one massacre, then somewhere that morning, an entire community walked into a normal day expecting nothing unusual, and by afternoon, almost none of them were left to tell anyone what happened. If it was repeated violence across generations, then this small patch of land, beautiful, fish-filled, full of birds and shade and water, was also quietly a place where people kept dying at each other's hands, year after year, until the lake finally dried up and buried the evidence in mud. So either way, the lagoon that gave so much also eventually took everything from somebody. And that contradiction, a place of abundance turning into a place of death, might be the oldest pattern in human history. We assume that war begins with scarcity, empty granaries, starving villages, people fighting over the last patch of farmland left standing. But Nataruk doesn't fit that story. This lagoon was rich. Fish, shellfish, birds, water that never fully disappeared, even as the climate around it grew harsher. So if it wasn't hunger, what was it? It is entirely possible that the violence here was not caused by too little. It may have been caused by too much, a resource valuable enough that more than one group wanted it, badly enough to risk everything to keep it or to take it. If that is true, then the oldest war we know of was never really about hunger. It might have been about something far more familiar to anyone alive today. Not the fear of having nothing, the fear of losing something good to somebody else. There is no name for the people who died at Nataruk. No language has survived to tell us what they called themselves, what they called the lagoon, what they called the people they may have feared. We do not know if they saw it coming. We do not know if there was a warning, a rumor, a sighting of strangers near the water days before, or if it happened with no warning at all, ordinary morning folding instantly into catastrophe. What we do know is carved permanently into bone, fear, force, and the unmistakable proof that even people with no permanent home, no stored wealth, no walls to defend, were already capable of turning on each other with terrifying coordination. Maybe that is the most unsettling discovery of all. Not that ancient people were violent. Almost everyone already assumes that somewhere in the back of their mind. The unsettling part is how familiar it all sounds. A valuable place. More than one group who needs it. Fear of losing it. And eventually violence that someone 10,000 years later has to dig out of the mud just to understand what happened. You have lived through versions of this same pattern, even if nothing about your life looks remotely like Nataruk. A job you were afraid someone else would take. A house, a relationship, a place in line you felt the need to protect, even when no one was physically threatening you. The instinct to defend what is yours, the fear that drives people to do things they would never otherwise do, did not begin with armies or empires. It may be far older than that. It may be the same instinct that, 10,000 years ago, turned a lagoon full of fish and birdsong into a place where 27 people never got to walk away. We like to believe that violence is something we invented along the way, a mistake we picked up somewhere between farming and writing and building walls, but she is still there, in the mud, where they left her. Someone already knew exactly what fear could make a person do. Nataruk suggests we brought it with us from the very beginning, before agriculture, before cities, before anything we would recognize as civilization. The fear was already there. The instinct to protect, to compete, to strike first was already there. We did not learn it from history. History learned it from us. If this story changed the way you think about how old human violence really is, leave a like to support the video. And subscribe to The Strange Past to discover more strange and forgotten stories from human history. Because our past was far stranger and far older than we imagine.